Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Sadeq, and again, the co-founder, COO of AccurKardia. Today, we'll be chatting about ECG as a broad digital biomarker and its potential to transform healthcare. Hey, Sadeq, how's day going for you so far?
Uh, Pretty good, pretty good. We'll get into that, I'm sure.
Well, yeah, glad you're having a good day. We're going to have a good conversation either this afternoon, this evening for people across the pond. But just diving deep into it, Sadiq, what does it mean, ECG as a broad digital biomarker? And secondarily, how does that define or redefine its role in the modern healthcare?
Yeah, so when you think of broad biomarkers, let's leave the word digital aside for a second. Really two come to mind from the point of view of really physiological biomarkers. The first is blood, and the other is DNA. Both give you a lot of information around someone's physiology, how they may be doing, how they may do in the future, etc. You don't think of ECG as a very broad biomarker. You think of it in the context of certain conditions, certain arrhythmias, certain types of heart attacks. You don't necessarily think of it as really even covering all of cardiology, leave alone going beyond cardiology. And we as a company are amongst a few other companies making the claim that ECGs are a much broader biomarker than previously imagined, both within the context of cardiology, but really well outside cardiology as well. In that context, we have some, our core FDA cleared algorithms primarily focus on a lot of the established use cases such as arrhythmias, but we now have breakthroughs for things like aortic stenosis detection, which traditionally required a echocardiogram, still requires an echocardiogram for final diagnosis. We have another breakthrough for the detection of something called hypokalemia, which is basically high potassium levels in the blood that requires a blood test today. Again, we're able to find indications of that using an ECG as well. And we're not the only company or set of researchers making this claim. A few months ago, there was a study put out in Nature by folks from Mass General at Harvard that basically identified about 600 plus diseases that could be profiled using ECGs. So essentially, we're at a point where we basically believe that there's a lot more information in ECGs than really previously imagined. And that's not that surprising if you think about it, right? So if you think of like a single 250 hertz ECG signal, what that implies is that there are about 250 data points in that 1 second worth of ECG data. A typical ECG is about a 10-second recording. So in about 10 seconds, you have about 2,500 data points on a single lead. Now, if you multiply that out by 12 leads, you have close to 30,000. The number of data points just starts to increase exponentially. So if you start thinking about ECGs over a much longer period, imagine even a single lead ECG recorded at 250 hertz over a 30-day period, you're talking really like more than half a billion data points. There's absolutely no way that even the best, most trained expert, cardiologist, electrophysiologist in the world is going to be able to look at that and draw correlations across all of it and come up with a diagnosis, right? But as a result of AI, we're able to really look at a lot of the hidden data within the ECG data and are able to derive meaning from it, which is why we believe it really has the potential of being a true broad biomarker. Essentially, from our perspective, the third major foundational biomarker right behind blood and DNA, but and in some ways complementary to it, but in some ways useful in ways that neither blood or DNA can be useful, particularly when it comes to things like remote patient monitoring, when it comes to things like continuous monitoring, or ease of use or cost effectiveness. In all of those contexts, ECGs just work a lot better. I mean, it's nothing more than really the electrical signal of your heart. And by definition, that's easily digitizable. And the minute it's digitizable, it can be analyzed.
That's great. I know you mentioned blood and DNA as other biomarkers to track, but why do you believe ECG deserves to stand alongside blood and DNA as a foundational biomarker for health?
Right. So if you let's take the example of hypokalemia, right? A place it's a significant condition that it impacts people that are on dialysis. People have to constantly watch the potassium level in the blood. 40% of patients, or actually about 30% of patients that are on dialysis actually end up dying, not because they cannot find a kidney. They end up dying because they get into a state that in sort of a hypokalemic state, which induces a cardiac arrest, and essentially that ends up being the cause of death. The way you diagnose that right now is, or a definitive diagnosis is a blood test. But frankly speaking, a lot of times by the time the blood test is done, the results are obtained, all of that, it takes some time, and it's also pretty expensive relative to an
Yeah.
ECG. On the other hand, if you can be if you can be monitored even on a passive basis while you're going about your daily routine through an ECG device, ideally a consumer device that you may have at home, that changes the way in which you can start to both manage these type of diseases as well as potentially predict the onset of these diseases.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And this looking through the news today with your organization, I recently saw that you and Heartbeam announced a strategic collaboration to advance cardiac monitoring innovation. And with
Yeah.
that focus, and again, congratulations on that partnership again, wonderful job.
Thank you.
But with that focus, what does a role of continuous ambient or wearable ECG monitoring play in shifting from a reactive to a preventative healthcare way of looking at things?
Yeah, so I think effectively, the other reason we are very bullish on the ECG signal is effectively AI is one aspect of it, right? AI enables you to see information and get insight from information that you otherwise couldn't. So that's one aspect of it. But there are sort of two other mega trends at play here that make this a very interesting opportunity. The second is that the ECG hardware is becoming quite ubiquitous. In the context of Heartbeam, they have like a credit card type reader where you can literally put your fingers and get an ECG recording, and that's obviously a very, very important step for us because the easier it is to record an ECG, the more information the use of it starts to increase. But that's just one example of really ECG hardware being used in a very ubiquitous way. We're seeing ECGs being embedded into everything from not just your smartwatches, but even biofabrics. I think a couple of years ago, the FDA cleared an ECG embedded toilet seat. There are ECGs being embedded into steering wheels of cars. I mean, ECG hardware basically is getting to a point where it's everywhere. And as that data starts to flood the system, you really need to have an AI layer that's able to in some sense, filter the signal from the noise. From my perspective, having a lot of data is arguably worse than having no data, particularly if that data starts to overwhelm your systems, right? So from that point of view, I think having ubiquity in ECG hardware is great, but then you have to have the software that can filter the signal from the noise and make that data actionable. And then the third piece of it, which frankly speaking, has taken off in a big way post-COVID, is telehealth and remote patient monitoring. Because a lot of times particularly for critical conditions, you need to have that last mile capability where if, for example, just throwing out an example of that, right? Like say a ventricular arrhythmia pops up when you're monitoring someone, you don't have much time to react, right? You really need to, at that point, be able to intervene. In that situation, you need to have those last mile capabilities. So really, it's the combination of artificial intelligence alongside the ubiquity of ECG hardware, alongside that last mile remote patient telehealth capability that's come together, that's making this worldview possible. If any one of those elements were missing, it would either not be possible or not be as useful.
Mm. I see the evolution of those type of wearables and technology has seen it kind of reach out to places that haven't been able to reach before that last mile. So, in your thought process, how do you see the next 5 to 10 years unfolding for ECG-based diagnostics and its role in shaping our global healthcare? I know you mentioned some of them, but what do you say 10 years from now?
Yeah, I think 10 years from now, it becomes in some sense really very, very ubiquitous, right? Even more ubiquitous than it is today, where we're starting to see it not just in watches or in in things like these card readers, like HeartBeam has, for example, but literally into biofabrics and things like that, right? Where you are being your heart rate, your electrical signal is being monitored in an ambient way on a more continuous basis. The technology to do that is to some degree already there, but it isn't yet ubiquitous to the degree that it can be. It has started to become ubiquitous from a smartwatch perspective, but it can go way beyond that in terms of modalities. So I think that will be critical. The other thing that's going to be critical is to go through the regulatory clearance processes for each of these conditions, right? So for example, when we spoke about the 600 different conditions that were profiled by Mass General, unlike blood, for example, where this has been established over a period of time, where you can do blood tests for various things. For each different condition, you have to go through, prove efficacy, prove the right level of sensitivity, specificity, PPV, do either retrospective studies, prospective studies, and get that clearance. And that process is not overnight.
Mm.
Frankly speaking, it probably takes, maybe 2 quarters, let's say, to build a good algorithm. It probably takes many multiples of that, based on our experience at least, to get the clearance needed to then deploy it into existing workflows, right? So that whole process is just honestly time consuming, and for good reason. You have to prove efficacy in an area where it hasn't been used before, right? So even in our context of hypokalemia, where we work with a lead one device, we have to prove efficacy before the FDA approves it. They've given us a breakthrough. They're working with us to make our path to clearance easier, but we still have to do what we need to do to get to that point. So in 10 years' time, our hope really is that a lot of these algorithms are cleared and can be deployed in the field and become very useful. So I think clearance is a big aspect, and the regulatory aspect is really important. Alongside that, the hardware becoming more ubiquitous is very important. And one of the other major things is just having as part of integrated clinical workflows, right? Because to be very honest, health systems right now are inundated globally, right?
Mm.
There's just a shortage of clinicians around the world. You take a look at cardiology, for example. I think in the UK, where I am right now, the ratio of people to cardiologists is something like 1:20,000. That
Oh,
number
wow.
increases to 1:100,000 in the US. In the US, there are essentially cardiology deserts, counties around counties where there are no cardiologists. So how do you get to those counties, and how do you monitor these people when they are remote? Having technology like this can definitely enable that, but it has to integrate into existing workflows in a way that doesn't add to the burden of the clinicians. So I think that is going to be extremely important as well. But really, the hope is in 10 years, all these three things come together: the ubiquity of the hardware, alongside the regulatory clearances that are needed for people to feel comfortable that at a minimum, some of these algorithms can be used as screening tools, even if they're not final diagnostics. So you can identify who needs treatment faster, whether they're in remote Arkansas or they're in New York City, right? Or honestly, anywhere in the world, because this particular ubiquity is not going to be just limited to the US. And then the third piece, of course, is having the workflow integrated model where you're not burdening the system more than it's already burdened.
Well, definitely, man. That's an amazing world I hope we all enter into in the next 5 or 10 years, and is providing healthcare to a lot of people that can't really have it in the most efficient manner. But Sadiq, no, it was a pleasure chatting with you today, and we look forward to hearing even bigger things from your organization over the next coming years.
Thank you. We're excited as well. Thank you for the questions. They were really good. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. Everyone have a wonderful day.